Hello. Today, I would like to walk you through the results of a project I've been working on recently about simulating the COVID-19 pandemic. Although we are now a few months into the pandemic, a few recent developments have really caught my eye and made me wonder about the transmission dynamics of the virus through communities. For one, during the last 2 months, we've seen huge surges across much of the United States. In this dashboard I've created to view publicly available coronavirus data, we can see that the population normalized case counts have increased markedly and rapidly in states across the country. What is particularly interesting is that these affected states have been geographically, socially, and politically diverse, but the situation has been remarkably similar nonetheless. Another recent development is the intensifying debate around reopening schools. Although much attention has been given to the health outcomes of students themselves, I've noticed a distinct lack of discussion about how schools reopening will affect transmission rates of the virus through communities as a whole. This striking image making its way around the internet was taken just this week at the first day of school reopening in Georgia. Finally, as people's social circles continue to adapt to the virus, I've noticed an increase in how willing people are to socialize with friends outside of their household, usually accompanied by the reason that the person that they are going to visit has been social distancing as well, or that they are meeting one-on-one. For these reasons, I've become interested in creating some kind of simulation where I could directly create different social situations, see how they affect the social network of a community, and model disease spread across that network. This project was inspired by two resources I have previously encountered. First, a very well-known research paper entitled Collective Dynamics of Small World Networks by Watts and Strogatz in 1998. This paper describes how many real-world networks exhibit what they call the small world phenomenon, where the network is comprised of many small clusters of individuals, but random connections across those clusters mean that the average number of steps to get between any two people is still quite small. Colloquially, this same idea is captured by the aphorism that you need no more than 6 degrees of separation to get between any two people in the world. Second, a few months ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, a number of authors created really informative and illustrative simulations of epidemic spread under different conditions. In particular, Harry Stevens at the Washington Post made an interactive news article and simulation which made the case for flattening the curve. We can see a snippet of it here. However, the simulation involves only randomly moving dots, which in my experience only really captures human behavior when bumper cars are involved. Shortly thereafter, a number of other authors created similar simulations, trying to expand on Stevens' work. One of whom, 3 Blue 1 Brown, a mathematician and YouTuber, tried to create more complex behaviors, such as intermittent trips to the market, isolated communities with occasional travelers between them, and other simulations. These were definitely more informative, but they still fundamentally were based around this marching points principle. I was therefore interested in investigating how the simulated transmission dynamics occur across more true-to-life social networks. So before we get into my work, however, I do want to make a disclaimer. The simulations I've created are not meant to fully capture the dynamics of the real world. Despite their complexity at times, they still present a vastly simplified scenario, often using educated guesses to fill in parameters which are simply not known at this time. These do not constitute health advice. Please consult resources from public health authorities about best practices to follow during this pandemic. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me show you what I've come up with. We begin by generating a sample of 250 households in our community, which is just shy of 600 people. The sizes of these households are modeled after those of the US population. The teal dots are children, the dark blue dots are adults, and the purple dots are elderly adults, which for our purposes will be synonymous with retired individuals. In our simulation, we have 5 different sources of social contact, represented by different color edges between the nodes. Here we can see the first, family edges, shown in gray. Next, we can see social gatherings, of which we have 2 kinds, group events, shown in light green, and one-on-one meetups, shown in dark green. For each simulation run, we can change the percentage of people who are willing to participate in the social gatherings of both kinds. This group then remains fixed throughout the run. Each hour, the number of group gatherings is drawn from a Poisson distribution with an average of 4.5, and the size of each of these gatherings is drawn from another Poisson distribution with a mean of 7. The count of people who socialize one-on-one is drawn from a binomial distribution with a 7% chance of being included. These parameters were chosen such that each socializing individual participates in 2 group activities and 3 one-on-one activities on average per week. Here we can see an example of one time step. We have 5 group events, 1 with 5 attendees, 3 with 6 attendees, and 1 with 9 attendees. We also have 42 people socializing one-on-one. The other 2 connection types are school and work. In our simulation, we have 2 schools and 15 workplaces, resulting in about 25 people per workplace and about 70 children per school. If we draw these connections, we can see the school in green and the work in blue. Drawn this way, however, the network is completely taken over. But if we rearrange the points to show the school and work clusters, we can see them much more clearly. Of course, we don't expect every person to be in contact with every other person at all times, so we can sparsify the network by randomly sampling connections every hour to include. The chosen sample rates were 2% for the schools and 3% for work per hour. These result in each adult coming into 1 hour long contact with 6 other individuals on average per day, and each child coming into 1 hour long contact with 10 other individuals on average per day. One improvement for the future would be to simulate various length interactions, but at the moment, I felt that these numbers were a fair average since we were only simulating a 1 hour long close personal contact. At the end of the day, however, we are more interested in comparing between different scenarios in our social network, so we do not need to expect that these parameters to be exactly true to life. Regarding the simulated virus, the parameters I've used are a 1/3 chance of passing on the virus from a 1 hour long close personal contact, a 1-day incubation period, a 3-day pre-symptomatic but infectious period, and 5 people randomly seeding the infection into the community. These numbers are loosely based around COVID-19, as far as current figures suggest, but they are also chosen to highlight the diversity of outcomes from our various model situations. A person in the incubating, pre-symptomatic, and recovered stages will act as normal. However, once at least one person in a family shows symptoms, the entire family immediately quarantines until all family members are recovered. Thus, 100% of interfamily spread will be from pre-symptomatic individuals only. Here's how the simulation proceeds. From 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., the social network is comprised of only family connections. From 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., however, it gets a little more complicated. During the week, if schools are open, then children's family connections are removed and replaced by school connections. Likewise, for adults, work connections. If schools and workplaces are closed, then the family connections are retained. 2 of the 15 workplaces, however, are deemed essential and stay open even when all other workplaces are closed. During the weekend, family connections are active, as well as any social connections which may be randomly made using the algorithms discussed above. Finally, from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m., the work and school social connections are removed and only family and social connections are made. Okay, so with the full process explained, let's take a look at the simulations. First, let's simulate if no mitigation steps are taken at all. Schools are open, workplaces open, everyone socializing as normal. The yellow dots are incubating, the orange dots are pre-symptomatic, and the red dots are symptomatic people. As we can see, before anyone showed any symptoms, almost the entire population was already infected. For our purposes, we do not need to simulate any deaths, but one need only imagine how much damage this scenario would do to our simulated community. The plot at the top shows the cumulative counts of infections per hour, broken out by the source of the infection. As we can see, family accounts for the most spread, followed by work, and then school and social gatherings. It took less than 2 weeks for the infection to completely run its course. Once it passes, everything returns to normal. But in the end, 589 people were infected. Now, from the worst case scenario to the best case. Schools closed, only essential businesses are open, and no one is socializing. Unlike in the first simulation, where the cases spread incredibly quickly, here the infection smolders among the community. However, at the end of the day, only families with someone who works at an essential business can be affected. The rest of the families are totally insulated. By week 3, therefore, the infection dies out. In the end, 79 people were infected. Of course, the best case scenario is not realistic. Much attention lately has been focused on a contingent of people who are still participating in group gatherings, as these are opportunities for super spreader events. So let's simulate what happens if 10% of the population continues to meet in group settings. Indeed, we can see substantial numbers of individuals are infected from the group gatherings, who then spread it to their own families. However, with only 10% of people participating, we know that the only families who can possibly be affected are those with a family member in an essential business or participating in group gatherings. The rest of the families are still isolated. Therefore, once again, the infection dies out by the 3rd week. Before it does, however, 161 people were affected, about twice as many as last time. A quick sidebar about these group events. One rather unintuitive feature of social networks is the growth in the number of edges versus the number of nodes. For example, let's suppose you're throwing a party. Inviting 22 people instead of 20 seems like a small increase, but in doing so, you've actually added 41 more social connections by inviting only 2 more people, because each of those 20 people is now connected to each of the newcomers as well. Here, we can see a visualization of how the number of edges increases against the number of nodes. Even as nodes slowly increase, we can see that the number of edges increases dramatically. Incidentally, this is also the reason for the unintuitive answer to the birthday paradox. This problem famously states that you require only 23 people in a group to have 50% chance of anyone sharing a birthday. The reason is because every single edge between those people is a comparison of birthdays to make. So instead of making 23 comparisons, we're actually making 253. In the exact same way, each connection in our simulation is a possible conduit of infection, so even relatively small group encounters can be cause for a widely spread infection. Okay, returning to the simulations, we will now add in the practice of socializing one-on-one. From anecdotal evidence of my own friends and family, it seems that the majority of people today have stopped attending group gatherings, but continue to meet up with some others individually. Here we will simulate the scenario of 80% of people now engaging in these small meetings. We can notice very quickly that this will once again greatly increase the case proliferation. This also extends the time of eradication from 2 weeks to 3 weeks, as we'll see, because the intermittency of these connections allows the infections to propagate more slowly without burning themselves out. While these meetings only have one interaction, unlike the large group gatherings, they also substantially increase the interconnectedness of the network. Complex links can be formed quickly. For example, suppose that each person in a 4-person family socializes with a person in a different family one weekend. Now these 5 different families are all connected within 2 steps. Once again, we have more than doubled our case count to 354 people infected. Finally, I'd like to present a simulation of a total shutdown, except for essential businesses, up until the beginning of week 3, at which point the schools will reopen. Begins just like the simulation of our best case scenario. As we can see, the infection comes very close to burning itself out, until suddenly, new social connections allow the infection to quickly spread to not just the children, but also the families of the children as well. By the end, 393 people were infected, our highest count since our worst case scenario. And now, let's compare the infection trajectories for each of these simulations all at once. So, although these simulations are obviously limited, I still think we can draw some useful insights from the comparisons between them. Here are a few takeaways I'd like to highlight. Number 1, family. In each scenario, even with schools and work open and full socialization, the plurality of new infections come from within families. Since family members consistently spend so much time together, and even more so with schools and workplaces closed down, in these simulations, as soon as one person in the household caught the infection, it would quickly spread to others before anyone even began showing symptoms. Then, while still in the pre-symptomatic phase, each one of those family members could still spread the disease to all of their contacts as well. This trend was especially apparent in the reopening schools scenario. While children luckily seemed quite resilient against the virus, this may not be true for family members sharing a household with a child attending school. This simulation therefore reinforces the recent suggestion by Dr. Deborah Birx that multi-generational families began wearing masks at home. For many, it would seem unnecessarily stringent to maintain distance and other health practices while at home, but these simulations suggest that it may be the single most important step in preventing wide-scale spread of the disease. Number 2, friends. If every other family is truly distancing themselves, then a small number of people who are widely socializing can affect only their own families. This kind of dynamic results in a rapid spread through the community, but also a rapid burnout of the infection. However, when we introduce one-on-one socializing, those infections now have a conduit to other families as well. This results in a slow burn phenomenon, where infrequent but sustained contact allows a small number of cases to spread through the community. The danger in this scenario is that the low number of cases is taken as a sign that large-scale activities can reopen, such as schools, which in turn allows the infection to spread readily once again. This seems to me to be an excellent model for the reasons why many U.S. states, especially Florida and California, saw massive spikes in cases even after protracted shutdowns. A popular op-ed by Paul Krugman in the New York Times in mid-July was entitled, "America Drank Away Its Children's Future." In it, he suggests that we could and should have maintained a longer shutdown on businesses until our cases were lower. These simulations suggest that this is only partially true. In our social network, even with schools and businesses shut down, the virus could maintain enough presence in a community to trigger an outbreak from small-scale social interactions alone. So while part of the responsibility lies with public authorities in deciding what should and shouldn't be shut down, it also lies with each individual to be wary of extraneous social contact, even if it is just with one other person. 3. Decisions. Finally, and unsurprisingly, during the trailing end of an infection outbreak, the difference between success and failure can be very small. Here is another different trial of reopening schools at the beginning of week 3. In this simulation, we change the people who seed the infection into the community. The infection simulation starts out very similarly. But we can begin to notice that our small change is enough to change the infection trajectory such that the infection dies out on its own just before schools reopen. In our original simulation, the difference of 1 week may have prevented a mass outbreak. The difference in case counts from 393 to 81 people infected. And while in a real world, it is never exactly clear when it's the perfect time to ease a lockdown, it is nonetheless our responsibility to remember that small changes can have large consequences. Everybody, from individuals to governments, continue to face moments of decision. The decision by one person to wear a mask at home, the decision to drive separately instead of sharing a car ride, the decision to reopen a workplace a few weeks later. All of these are small decisions. But when multiplied across the huge complexities of real-world social networks, they can be the difference between safety and outbreak. And unlike in these simulations, the consequences have been and will continue to be life and death.